Hi everyone. For those of you who visited the site during the summer, you would have had some idea of what was going on. And you know that it's the site of a Dominican priory that was founded. Okay, first of all, briefly its location. Trim Castle, at one end of Trim, the town walls, St Mary's Abbey, better known as the Yellow Steeple, to a lot of you here, St Patrick's Church, but the Black Friary is up here, outside the town walls. And the Dominicans, by and large, preferred to be outside the town walls when they came to towns. There are very few towns, Buttevant would be one of them, but by and large they put themselves outside the town walls, gave them a little bit more latitude, I think, in terms of the governance of the town and so on. So that's where the Black Friary sat, if you like, in relation to the other medieval aspects of Trim. The Boyne running through here, and the roads that you see marked on the map being the medieval roads and still in use today. The site as it is, any of you who visited would usually have come either through Griffin Park up through here, and we would have had our site cabins here and up here, or you may have come up by Railway Lane, back that way. And as you can see, it's now surrounded by housing, but in the medieval period, obviously, this would have been open land. And you can see this boundary feature here, and there's another peculiar boundary feature here, which I want to try and have a look at this coming summer. But this boundary here may have formed what was called the precinct of the Abbey. And this here is Railway Lane. These are the back gardens and houses on the Kells Road. And so the Kells Road might have been the boundary on the western side. The precinct itself was here on the northern side, and the town wall would have been down here. It's buried underground now, but the town wall was likely the southern boundary of the site. So that's just to give you the kind of setting. The Athboy Gate is just over here. There's a plaque on the wall marking its location. So the friars were just outside the Athboy Gate. Founded in 1263 by Geoffrey de Jonville. He was then the Justiciar of Trim, Justiciar of Ireland actually for a bit, Governor of Trim, married to Matilda de Lacy, had inherited through her. You're probably all familiar with that bit of the history. Just going back to this slide here, those of you who know Railway Lane know that it terminates in a little kind of cul-de-sac here. There's a garage, and we did excavations for Trim Town Council a number of years ago when ducting and lighting was going in. And we uncovered, just in front of that garage there, we uncovered some burials. One of which was actually cut into a backfilled well. So that kind of piqued our interest because we realised that what we'd hit on was the cemetery of the Black Friary. So the cemetery, clearly it's quite extensive. When we started the project, one of the first things we did was a topographical survey of part of it. Now, the slide I showed, this one here, you can see the topographical survey just covers actually a small part of the site. The buildings continue up here, and then this is the area out here that Steve was talking about, which probably didn't have buildings on it, but would have been what we call the infields. But this boundary here makes me wonder a little if there could even be earlier features. And it's a slightly raised area above the rest of the site. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the buildings, this is where the church was, the cloister, probably the kitchen ranges, and they're now looking at there appears to be another cloister and other ranges of buildings up here. It was a very large abbey. So it has the potential to be excavated for a very long time. So I might grow old there. Just to give you an idea of what it would have been like if it had been razed to the ground. And do you know how it came to be so in such a dilapidated condition? Well, the dissolution of the monasteries isn't to blame entirely for this one, because you know the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII, in the 1540s, the lands were sequestered effectively and handed over to, in this instance, the Bishop of Meath, who sublet to a farmer, Thomas Cusack. He seems to have used it as farm buildings, and we have had evidence for the reuse of a lot of building stone to make pathways, including the beautiful arch stones that form the cloister. But the buildings seem to have been intact, and so much so that in the 1580s it was suggested as a site for the proposed university in Ireland. They didn't bite, and so Dublin got it and Trinity College was founded. But it could have been here. This is what, if they'd left it alone, this is what it might have been like. This is Carlingford, Dominican Friary to Carlingford. Unfortunately, some bright spark in the 1780s, 1750s actually, the last Celtic Tiger, the last great building boom, the Georgian building boom, looked at the Black Friar and said, God, that's very handy. Quarry, and sold the buildings basically as a quarry. So the stonework, the good stonework, the reasonably regular blocks that would have faced all the buildings were just pulled off. And if you go around Trim and if you look at Georgian buildings in Trim, bet your bottom dollar, that's the Black Friary. So, well, you could say recycling, but it's unfortunate. So what we're left with is this footprint, which, although it's very sad, and I'd love to have this to deal with, if we were dealing with this, we'd be doing an entirely different kind of excavation. Because what this allows us to do is actually to kind of dig in and see the structure, and see the foundations, and see how the buildings were put together. So it's quite useful, although, as I said, I would like, it would be lovely if this is what we were dealing with. Just take a look at that. I want you to note this here, because you can see this would have been the bell tower. This is the interior of the church, looking towards where the doorway would have been. The east window was up this end. And you can see that there's an arch here and an exit out of the church there. So there are two plinths projecting out from the main wall of the church here, and the same on the opposite side, springing up to form this great arch, the chancel arch. And this would have been what we call a crossing tower, a tower over the centre of the church, separating the nave from the chancel. When we started excavations here a couple of years ago, we opened a cutting in the area where there was still visible masonry. And what we actually found were two similar plinths, believe it or not, terribly dilapidated, relatively narrow, but that is what they are. And the examination of them, now that we've found part of the north wall of the church, shows that they're effectively not properly bonded together. I didn't show you a close-up of the Carlingford one, but if you looked at that, you would see that those buttresses supporting the bell tower are not actually bonded into the wall of the church, all bar one, where there was one small tower prior to the big tower being built. This is a feature of abbeys in Ireland. The bell towers were frequently not built until the 14th century. There's only one known exception, and that is Buttevant, which is believed to have been built in the 13th century, the bell tower. But usually, here at Trim, the Dominican Friary is a 13th century building. It's likely that the bell tower wasn't built until the 14th century. So it's an add-on, a very effective and strong add-on, but an add-on nonetheless. So that's what we got in our first year here. We opened cuttings here, here, and here. And in the second year, we opened a cutting in this area to span the north wall of the church and go into the cloister. And we uncovered a lot of stonework, including part of the cloister wall, which you can see here, extending across the cutting. But you can see the amount of rubble. I mean, that is what we have to get through in every cutting we open in order to get down to the archaeology, because the destruction was so thorough, and any stone that wasn't useful to them to be taken away, they just tossed around the place. So digging through this stuff is a lot of fun. And if anybody wants to come along and join us, let me know. So we had got to the point last year of getting our way down through this rubble, and what people are actually working in here is the foundation trench of the north wall of the church. Literally, it had been robbed away right into its foundations. That's how thoroughly dismantled it was. However, you can see that there's stonework still in position up here. And the reason for that was that what was uncovered here was what you call an ossuary, or a charnel pit. And this is a compartment which was frequently found in churchyards where when graves were being dug and old burials were disturbed, the bones which were disturbed were taken away and placed within a special container, as it were, so that they would still be in consecrated ground, although it is recorded that every so often friars in churches would clear out these ossuaries and burn them and have a bone fire, becoming bonfire. So, there were various practices. So anyway, we had uncovered this ossuary, we had uncovered the foundation trench by the end of last year's season. So when we resumed work this year, in addition, we had found human remains burials in the cloister garth. This is a child of about between 9 and 12 years of age. So we were aware that there were burials out in the cloister garth as well, which quite possibly, we haven't dated them yet, but are quite possibly post-medieval in date. And there's a whole interesting question about how long the graveyard was used. We had also opened another cutting 4, which is this is actually cutting 5, and it is the south-west corner of the cloister. So you can see the cloister wall carrying on here, going around the corner there. And can you see these stones here? These are actually, they would have formed the arches of the cloister arcade. We'll come back to those later on. But you can see that they were actually put down on the ground and used as a pathway, probably as part of the farmyard in the post-medieval period. That's what the place had come to. So we'd also been finding fragments of worked stone, and this is what they call Purbeck marble, which is the same as the cloister arch fragments imported from Dorset. And we can speak a little bit about that later on afterwards. So, and column fragments as well were coming up in the rubble. So when we resumed work this year, this very, very wet year, it was a case of back down on the hands and knees and work our way through the soil. You can see this linear arrangement of stones here and here just peeking through the soil. This, I believe, is actually the last remnants of what they call a rood screen. Don't know if anybody's heard that term. It would have been a structure that would have separated the nave, which is where, if you like, the laity would have sat in a church, from the chancel, which was the area where the altar was and where the friars, monks would have sat. And there seems to have been some sort of a structure there, built at some point in the life of the church, not necessarily at the very beginning, but that's the last gasp of it, literally. So we were back on site. The cloister wall had been exposed last year, the foundation trench is in here, and we knew that we had burials or human bone in that ossuary container, but we weren't sure whether we would find burials within the church or not. We knew we had some burials in the cloister area. However, we found plenty of burials. This is the ossuary, and you can see there's disarticulated human bone in there. And then carried on working on it. And then we got quite a surprise and realized, you can see here, there's an intact human burial. This burial is actually in the floor of the church. This ossuary, or as it actually turns out now to be, wall tomb, would have been a separate structure within the wall of the church. If you can imagine the stone wall being excavated out to form a chamber within the wall, and somebody laid to rest in there. So it formed an actual tomb that somebody was interred in. Now, to be buried within the wall of the church, within the chancel, presupposed somebody important and presumably of high social status. We don't know yet if it is a member of the religious community. I suspect not, because there's a good chance that this person's actually female, not male. So some important woman. We do know that Geoffrey de Jonville and his wife were buried in the Black Friary. This could be the tomb of Matilda de Lacy. We don't know. We probably will never know for certain, but it's nice to speculate. So here is the ossuary, and this is the floor of the church. This would be effectively the nave of the church. And what you're seeing here are grave cuts, here and here. This is the structure I spoke about earlier. You really can't see it, but the rood screen, which separates the nave from the beginning of the chancel area. And the nature of the burial on this side is very different from the nature of the burial there. An awful lot more people seem to be packed in there, as if people were deliberately desirous of being buried that bit further up the church. And it is interesting that while the Dominicans, founded in around 1224 with a mission to combat heresy and preach to the poor, had by 1263 in Ireland clearly succumbed to the whole lure of, you know, if you want to, well, one presumes, because this was common practice, if you want to be buried inside the church, it's going to depend probably on your donations and your almsgiving and your what have you. And so it's a sense of, you know, selling the best spots, who knows. There's another possibility though, and that is that plague would have been prevalent right through. I mean, you've all heard of the Black Death, which absolutely ripped through Europe in the 1300s and 14th century. But there were episodes of plague probably every 10 years or so. And so at times like that, there would have been huge pressure on burial places. And it is quite possible that at times like that, it was a case of, you know, bury people as quickly as possible. I don't think, though, that the areas inside the church, unless again there were wealthy families who had a right to be buried there or who had bought a right to be buried there. You know, I don't think people would have been buried willy-nilly in a church, even with plague. They would have been buried outside in plague pits or in the cemetery. But it is another aspect of this whole question of burial and funeral rites, you know, how people coped with plague. Obviously, one of the things that the students are very much concerned in is the process of learning how to record. So here you can see Kirsten having carefully excavated this young woman, is detailing the burial. Jessica is engaged in planning, and this is a sample of the kind of plans that are produced. And here Kirsten is examining the bones, because that young woman she excavated had a very peculiar feature, which was an additional sixth lumbar vertebra, which is not very common, but is known from certain populations and maybe something that you might trace genetically, that it could be something that related members of the same family might have. So these are things that we look out for as well, because one of the intriguing things would be to try and distinguish, say, family groupings. My own personal pet project would be, if I could find sufficient funding, would be to do DNA analysis of a number of the burials here, and then to do DNA analysis with the population in Trim and see if you could actually find relationships. Because I'm perfectly certain that for people who are natives of Trim, that a number of your ancestors are buried up in the Black Friary. I mean, it is inevitable. Just in terms of wider comparisons, this is a site in England, a Dominican friary, called in Guildford. And interestingly enough, the normal layout of a friary would have the cloister obviously at its centre and the church to the north to allow the maximum light into the cloister area. The Dominicans in Trim, as I said to you, they always like to stay outside the wall. The site they were given was on the north side of the town, but they always put their church closest to the people, to the town. So this meant that their church went on the south side of the cloister, sort of flipping the usual plan on its head. Guildford, funnily enough, is the same. The church, as you can see, is on the south side. And equally, they have a lot of burials within the nave. They had some up around the choir, and they've got their cemetery out here. And it's just interesting to find these parallels. The form of the church could not be a million miles from the one we're seeing here as well. So part of the ongoing research is to find these comparisons, to see what people got elsewhere, and to see how this relates to that. So far, certainly looking at Dominican friaries in Ireland, I can tell you that the Dominican friary here in Trim is definitely one of the largest. The church is a good 20% larger than the church, say, in Sligo. It was built clearly with an intent to be impressive and imposing. And if you just stop and think a minute of how it would appear to have somebody to have come into the town of Trim, say from the Kells Road or, you know, from out that side, in the medieval period, they would have come to a town that had 3 religious institutions in it. The Augustinian Friary, where the Yellow Steeple is now, the Franciscan Friary, where the courthouse is now, and the Dominicans up there. It had the castle. It had a lot of fine, I would imagine, stone houses. It had St. Patrick's, the parish church, with its impressive tower. And it had Newtown Trim, just on the outskirts. So it would have been a remarkably impressive looking place. For people coming in from the countryside where houses were probably small and so on, the town would have looked very sophisticated and very exotic, you know. So it's interesting to reflect on that, how it would have presented itself in that period of time. And also to remember that every year there was an annual fair in Trim, and people came from all over Europe to it, to buy and sell. And it lasted up to a fortnight. So you can imagine the excitement every year when that was coming around, and probably the drunken and disorderly behaviour and what have you. But you know what changes. So getting back to our excavations, we wanted also to extend out from the church and to at least fix definitely on the ground where the extent of the cloister was. So we opened a number of additional cuttings, and luckily we're able to spot the corners. So this then is the northeast corner of the cloister. And you can see this is the cloister wall, corner here, wall going up there, and there's the beginnings of a buttress, an internal buttress in the corner. And also, if you look, you can see this little regular piece of stone is actually one of the Purbeck columns that would have held up the cloister arcade, a fragment of it, just discarded. That's another view of it with more of the buttress exposed. In the northwest corner, we started looking, hunting, playing hunt the wall. And you can see we're getting down onto it there. Niall is busy working away, and he's uncovering what turns out to be part of a buttress there too. There's more of it exposed, and you can see rough stone here, and this very flat-looking surface here. This is actually mortar capping on the surface of the wall. And the interesting thing about that is that this, when we took a level on this, and took a level on the same surface that was on the wall over in the northwest corner, or the northeast corner, they were the same to within a centimetre or two. So there had obviously been a concern to make sure that the top of the cloister wall maintained the same level the whole way around. And sat on this bed of mortar were these very fine, what they call sill stones. There were slabs of this polished Purbeck marble, and we had fragments of a couple remaining in situ. These would have been about 10 centimetres thick, and they would have provided the level surface on which then sat the columns to carry the arches that would have finished off the cloister arcade. Very precise building, because when you're putting up these arches that have to absolutely match each other, you have no tolerance. You can't have your wall dipping and rising. Everything has to be absolutely level. So it just is, it's an indication of the level of craftsmanship that was brought to bear. I mean, other parts of the church, the stone walls are relatively rough, but that didn't matter because the exterior faces would have been plastered, and only the fine sandstone which went around the windows and doors would have been visible. So it would have presented a very, not a rustic kind of facade, but a very sophisticated appearance. So when we dug down a little more in this buttress, we realised that the stones here, they're limestone, but they're actually battered with a slope like that on them, very nicely fitted. So these internal buttresses would have been very nice features in their own right. So again, the kind of craftsmanship that was going in to build the cloister was extended to that kind of detail. In the post-medieval period, as I've said, a lot of the stone was recycled to form a pathway, and you can see this is part of this pathway that we've had going from the south of the cloister northward, just outside the cloister wall. But you can see this here, it's the base of two columns, and it's a double column, which would have sat on the sill stones that I was speaking about, and the column stones, the two columns would have risen from that, then carrying the arch stone. And that's just chucked in to form an infill in the path, you know. This, just to give you an idea, this is Mellifont. So when I'm speaking about columns and cloister arcades, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, except at Blackfriary, these arches would have been formed by perhaps 3 stones only of very finely worked Purbeck marble. This is just limestone or sandstone here at Mellifont. It was much fancier in Blackfriary. This is a very strange view, you probably find it hard to make it out, of the underside of one of those fragments of arch stone that I'm talking about. This is a dished surface. This is the back of it, which is an oblique, very finely worked face. And the front face that would have been visible has this beautiful roll moulding, which is kind of hard to see there. The Purbeck marble it's from Dorset in England. It's a limestone that's actually composed of it's very, very fossil rich, but the fossils are freshwater fossils, not seawater fossils, and they're tiny. And this makes for a very brittle but very beautiful stone. And according to the layers, the beds within the quarry, you get colours that are tinges of purples, greens, or creams. And so you get this array of colours that are available as well. It's a very difficult stone to work, and it would have needed to be ground down. So literally, the stonemasons, in making those arched faces, had to use a template and had to ensure that the curvature that they were working for in every single stone was exactly matching. And that the angles of the ends, so that they would butt against each other properly, were exactly right. So it's very, very detailed, painstaking work. And I'm sure it cost a bomb. You know, this is the other point about it. This didn't come cheap, you know. We have fragments of sandstone as well that would have, you know, just the outside, the window frames and the door frames. And what you can see slightly not very clear there is a mason's mark. I'm sure you've all heard of mason's marks. When a stonemason was working on a stone, he put his own mark on it, and there's a whole series of mason's mark. Ian, who works with me here, has been doing a bit of a study of them. And the interesting thing about them is that you can find them, you can trace them from building to building, so you can see where a mason worked. And sometimes the mark was handed from father to son, or a son might have a mark that was like his father's, but with an additional line or something else, just like a tradition handed down. But the reason for the mason's mark was that it simply ensured that the mason got paid, because he could say, I made that stone, I worked that stone, you pay me now. So it's the stonemason's signature. This is Mellifont again, and in terms of talking about what the ultimate vision for Blackfriary would be, we know that we've got, you know, just fragments of stone walls left and the foundation trenches which mark the position of them. But it is still possible to present them to the public, and so that people could actually see the layout of the abbey. So maybe in time to come, if the project is successful with a lot of hard work, something like this might actually take the place of the rather derelict field that's there at the moment. That would be our kind of hope and aspiration anyway. So thank you all for your attention, and any questions we'd be glad to answer them.